Good morning. My name is Stephen Simons, and welcome to my presentation titled Achtung Spitfeuer, How British War Comics of the 50s, 60s, and 70s aided the formulation of a militarized state of mind among white English speakers during apartheid. Growing up in the 1970s, Friday afternoons were something to look especially forward to. A school-free weekend beckoned, and my gran would visit, bearing a gift in the form of a battle, warlord, or action comic. I have vivid memories of spending rainy afternoons devouring those comics and their stories of bravery on World War II battlefields, where the heroes and victors were almost always British or American soldiers waging a just war against the Axis forces of the Germans and Japanese. British war comics dominated the shelves of newsagents from the 1950s to late 1980s and were published by IPC Fleetway in London and DC Thomson in Dundee, Scotland. British war comics can be placed into two categories: pocket library books and weekly comics. The pocket libraries were generally 64-page self-contained narratives in a digest format, featuring covers in color and black and white illustrations within each issue. Weekly comics were in A4 format and typically 32 pages in length, and were essentially serialized anthologies of approximately 7 strips per comic. Titles included Battle, Warlord, and Action. Battle ran for 673 issues. But what is it about these seemingly innocuous childhood experiences of reading British war comics that aided the apartheid regime's program of militarizing white South African males in preparation for their compulsory national service? My PhD research focused on the militarized childhoods and conscription of white males into the former South African Defence Force, or SADF, and how their memories navigate the ambiguities of a post-apartheid space. During my interviews with ex-conscripts, I discovered that a generation of English-speaking men had grown up reading British war comics, and that the narratives of these comics had, in some cases, aided the formulation of a white militarized masculinity. Militarization in apartheid-era South Africa culminated in national service and was perceived by white society as normative, clearly mapped out from childhood as an inescapable performative rite of passage. The thought of becoming a soldier was fraught with uncertainty, infused with trepidation, and juxtaposed with a boyish sense of pride. My romantic notions of soldiering were typical male constructs, born of comic books, chivalrous Biggles novels, British war movies of the 1950s, and of course Saturday afternoons spent playing soldiers with neighborhood friends. Yet the inevitability of conscription always seemed to cast an ominous shadow over my youth, including the tens of thousands of other white boys during the apartheid era. Conscription prescribed a complex matrix of acceptable masculine responses within familial and societal spaces, abetted by schools and religious institutions. The British war comic was, in many respects, an indirect aid to the regime's project of militarizing boys. This presentation will refer to examples and provide quotes from ex-conscripts that will demonstrate the indelible influence of these comics on English-speaking boys during apartheid, which aided the tacit construction of a militarized state of mind and the ideologies of the apartheid regime and SADF. The germination of a militarized masculinity begins in childhood, and toys are often echoes of the adult world. War toys, such as toy guns, reinforce the notion that a military solution is a masculine, collective, and socially acceptable response. Toys essentially embody social and cultural definitions of what constitutes appropriate interests, activities, and the behavior of children. Interestingly, the role of comics has been somewhat neglected, and on further investigation, I was surprised at how often the act of reading and collecting comics was referred to by English-speaking interviewees during my PhD research. So what was it about the content of these British war comics that aided the process of militarization? I would like to start with the role that children played in the narratives that appeared in these comics. In this case, boys at war. Depictions of the heroic acts of boys at war were commonplace in British war comics, such as Battle and Warlord, and function as a form of heroic realism. The above examples depict World War I and World War II narratives of courageous acts by boy soldiers, more specifically underage combatants and civilians. These narratives reinforced romanticized and masculine notions that not only men, but boys were capable of playing a vital role in the defense of a nation. To quote Andrew, an ex-SADF conscript, "But it all seemed very glorious as a child, playing with an R1 rifle and watching my parents, friends and family cleaning and assembling their automatic rifles in the living room, which was nothing odd. Also, we played with my uncle's army wedding and outfits as kids. So military stuff was part of life. War comics were our first points of contact when it came to visualizing war." The following examples depict an episode from the American Civil War and the First World War. The romanticized and hyper-patriotic notion of boys waging war as capably as adults was a common theme, providing readers with identifiable heroes of a similar age. In this sense, children were not necessarily exempt from war, yet if the need arose, a boy could also be called upon to serve his country. To quote Andrew, an ex-SADF conscript, "My grandfather was a pilot in the war. The experience defined his future and mine to a degree, even today. The image or sound of a Spitfire moves me emotionally. Comics like Warlord brought his wartime experience and service to life for me, because he never spoke of his time in the Air Force." Achtung Spitfeuer. The narratives of aerial warfare were a staple of all British war comics. The impersonal nature of aerial warfare and the concept of engaging and destroying machines rather than men emphasized the distancing of a faceless enemy. Additionally, Battle of Britain narratives of an island nation facing overwhelming odds dovetailed ideally with the apartheid-era concepts of total onslaught and the Rooi Gevaar. To quote Paul, an ex-SADF conscript, "Yes, I grew up on Battle and Tiger comics. The Germans and Japanese were always seen as the enemy, much like the terrorists of the border war. I must add, at the time, I never drew any parallels between the two." Essentialized and racist depictions of the enemy, particularly of Japanese soldiers, were commonplace. Comics such as Warlord and Battle Picture Weekly would regularly feature scenes of caricatured Japanese and German combatants engaged in acts of torture or extreme violence. This othering, dehumanizing, and simplification of the enemy using racist stereotypes could act as subtle propagandistic aids in the formulation of racist views, particularly among young readers. Notably, within a South African context, it required no great imaginative leap to substitute the comic book enemies with those of the apartheid regime. To quote Alan, an ex-SADF conscript, "There's no doubt in my mind that those war comics played a role in my perception of the enemy. And back then, we were told the enemy were communists or terrorists, wanting to turn South Africa into a Soviet puppet state. As a child and avid reader of war comics, I imagined the enemy as monsters, as no different to the Nazis." Steve elaborates further. "We'd spend Saturday afternoons coloring in the Battle Picture library comics, skimming the stories and never realizing that our concept of war as a just and honorable cause was defined by those stories. We had no idea of what awaited us in the SADF, and on one level, we were very naive and seduced by it all." War Picture Library and Battle Picture Library were 64-page pocket library war comic magazines, published by Amalgamated Press and Fleetway over a period of 26 years. Commando Comics was first published in 1961 and remains Britain's longest-serving war comic. These pocket-sized comic books featured complete stories and often took the form of redemptive morality tales. The horror and human cost of war was of secondary importance in relation to acts of heroism, and the concept of an ultimate sacrifice in service to one's country or comrades. Several series that appeared in comics such as Warlord and Battle Picture Library attempted to present the war from the perspective of Axis soldiers, in most instances German Luftwaffe or Panzer officers. These Axis protagonists were vehemently anti-Nazi and always chivalrous, often risking their lives to prevent war crimes such as the summary execution of Allied soldiers, prisoners, or civilians. Narratives consistently attempted to make a clear distinction between honorable Wehrmacht soldiers and Nazi extremists of Waffen-SS divisions. Notions of honor, duty, and service to one's country, even if you were on the losing side, served as common denominators and moral reference points, deserving of respect, irrespective of what side a soldier was fighting on. To quote Peter, an ex-SADF conscript, I thoroughly enjoyed the comic series from the German perspective. I suppose I compared South Africa's plight during apartheid to the Germans as the underdog of the world. There was a rather strange connection or comparison that I formed between South Africa and World War II German soldiers. Patrick, an ex-SADF conscript, elaborates further. As a child, growing up during apartheid, I would often wonder what a terrorist looked like. You could say my only reference was UK war comics. In my mind, they were communist bogeymen who looked a lot like World War II Japanese soldiers. I suppose those comics did influence me. A common theme of British war comics was the perception of threat, whether real or imagined. This required the use of language as a means of cementing the concept of an alien other. Japanese soldiers were referred to as nips, yellow bastards, or Japs, whereas German soldiers were referred to as Krauts or Fritz. Note the use of color and bold typography to draw attention to headlines such as Encircled, Hell Island, and Track of Terror. In all of the following examples, there's a pervasive element of threat, and within the racialized divides of the apartheid era, comic book representations of an objectified enemy dovetailed ideally with the regime's references to the enemy as terrorists or commies and the concept of the SWAT and Roy Gevaar. To quote Terry, an ex-SADF conscript, this idea of dying for your country, or at the very least serving your country, was drummed into us from an early age. We sang De-Stem at assembly, had cadets at high school, and were told that South Africa is blessed with natural resources and the best army in Africa. We were invincible as one of the good guys, not unlike those heroes in the war comics I collected. Although the narratives of British war comics were not directly related to conflicts within Southern Africa during apartheid, their depictions of conflict were driven by moral, nationalist, or political means which offered obvious propagandistic connections in furthering the agendas of the apartheid regime. Therefore, the influence of British war comics on white English-speaking apartheid-era boys offered a disturbing view of how popular media allowed for subtle manifestations of nationalism that continue to echo into the present. To quote Garth, an ex-SADF conscript, those comics wouldn't be allowed on the shelves in the new South Africa. They were so politically incorrect and would probably be banned as racist material nowadays. They often had SWAT stickers on the covers, and the Japanese were always drawn with exaggerated features. Yet they were very impressionable. The Sergeant Raker comic strip was published by Warlord magazine. The series ran from early 1979 to 1984. Sergeant Raker was a rare depiction of a black soldier in the US Army and military police during World War II. Sergeant Raker did not only have to face his enemies, but also had to deal with issues of racism from his comrades. The series was reprinted under the lamentable title Black Boy in the French comic Bengali, which ran from 1983 to 1985. So to conclude, I'd like to add the following quote. I cannot think of any of my English-speaking childhood friends who did not read British war comics. They offered boys during the apartheid era in South Africa a romantic view of the world wars, particularly the Second World War, and in a sense also gave voice to the silences of parents and grandparents who had served and fought. Of course, what remained was the romantic notion of a just war, of defending home and hearth from a total onslaught. These views would nevertheless fade to some extent during adolescence, but strangely they remained impressionable elements of the process of militarizing South Africa's white English-speaking males during apartheid. The following artworks were my creative replies to British war comics of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. These artworks, amongst others, were exhibited at the 2018 Nutria exhibitions at the Cape of Good Hope Castle and at the University of Pretoria, forming part of my PhD research project at the University of Pretoria. The reimagining of images, characters, and excerpts from British war comics within a South African historical context, in this case focusing on the conscription of white males during apartheid, allowed for interesting visual, historical, and conceptual linkages to occur. How British war comics aided the tacit construction of a militarized state of mind during apartheid certainly calls for further research and offer a disturbing view of how popular media allowed for subtle manifestations of nationalism to be entrenched and influence the nation's youth. Thank you for listening to my presentation.